Hi, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the broadcast. It is Monday, October 10th, 2016. There are really two places that this broadcast comes from. First, it comes from the place that at times I think we make the mistake of focusing on behavior at the cost of real healing, at the cost of real deep therapy. And then that becomes less generalizable going forward. It doesn't transfer to the programs, to the support, to real life after Evoke. Second is there's also a movement in our country with wellness therapy programs at times to talk about behavioral therapy and how and where, if at all, it belongs in our treatment program. So I want to talk about it from that perspective, but I really want to also speak to parents who, for many good reasons, get very worried about their child's behavior and how it's showing up as unsafe, as unhealthy. So let's talk about all of those things tonight in that context. Thinking about the root issue. This is from the opening line, from the opening chapter heading of the book, of my book on behavioral change. I say using behavioral tools is fine, but only if they are nested in love and awareness. And we would be wise to first listen to what that behavior is telling us before we launch into changing it. And I can't tell you how often I tell parents and staff and even clients and students to slow down. Most people want to go to behavioral change. One, they think that's what the focus and the import is. Second is there's some shame there associated with making mistakes or doing it wrong. So people go to that place of trying to change it. Often I would say to my clients, slow down, take some time. Let's pay attention to what's going on. If you just change the behavior, then you're not going to get at the root of the issue, which is some kind of wound, some kind of hurt, some kind of trauma, some kind of unwellness in you. And so we don't want to remove that behavior because it's speaking to us. It's telling us a story, and we're going to try to get better at listening to that story. There's an old famous quote that says, of course behaviorism works, so does torture. I think when we hear the word behaviorism, we think of things like punitive and coercive, uncaring. We think of simple things like a token economy or the simple carrot and a stick. I think we get held hostage by the idea of behavioral theory. And what we have lacked is the ability to understand that it's progressed significantly, that it becomes one part of the puzzle in an overall treatment plan. And most theories will talk about it. These are the kinds of theories and approaches that use behavioral reinforcement as a part of their model. Assertiveness training, role-playing models, relaxation training, right? Learning to manage your anxiety and watching on maybe an EKG machine or some other machine, watching how you can relax yourself, how you can slow down your pace, slow down your breathing. Social skills training, exposure therapies, which are proven to be a critical part, a critical contribution to overcoming phobias and fears and anxiety. Cognitive behavioral therapy. I would say almost everybody who does therapy accesses some cognitive behavioral techniques, some ideas, concepts when they do it. EMDR, it's another therapy that's used to treat trauma and the trauma underneath the behavior and to unwind it, to unpack it, to heal it in that process. Relapse prevention training, problem solving therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is very research proven. Right? It's evidence-based, and it's one of the hot new approaches, especially in dealing with bipolar, some addictions, self-harming, and dangerous behaviors. It has an effective approach, and even the word behavior is in its name. So I think sometimes when we think about, get paralyzed by it as parents, or we buy into that marketing idea that we're not trying to change behavior at all, or we're not going to pay attention to that, or we're not going to use behavioral reinforcement theory at all, I think we miss an important part of how it can inform us and help us. And for those of us who focus too much on it, I think pulling way back from it can be important, but we don't have to throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. We can take from it some wisdom and ideas. Avoidance of a behavioral approach makes you no more immune to the principles of behaviorism than avoidance of science makes you immune to gravity. The fact of the matter is, folks, no matter what we do, it becomes some part of what we do. Even reinforcing by verbally praising or acknowledging what somebody's doing is simple behavior reinforcement, right? Giving somebody a symbolic gift or a token that symbolize a rite of passage model. All of those are reinforcement, and they become a part of the package. I think some people make this distinction that it's either behavioral or it's relational or insight therapy. And the fact of the matter is we can think of those on two continuums. How much behavioral therapy, behavioral reinforcement do you use in your approach? And at the same time, those can be high or low on the relational and insight scale too. So they're not mutually exclusive of each other, and they can complement each other. Early behaviorism discounted introspection. Modern behaviorism views thoughts and feelings as just as important as overt action, right? We start to understand what the famous behavioral Skinner said about the black box. We start to pay attention to what goes on in the mind, to what goes on between the stimulus and the response. That's a huge important part of it, right? Even the assignment we have in our program that talks about, right, a paper talking about the benefits of destructive behaviors. We want to understand what's getting reinforced. When we talk about addiction, we talk about the idea about how it provides a chemical reinforcement, a sense of well-being. And the quicker the response is, the less effort you have to put in it to get that positive response, the more addictive it is. So we want to replace those old behaviors, those old things that we're seeking after that are unhealthy, with new things to meet that core need. I remember this famous story when I was very young. I think I might have even been in high school, at least undergraduate school. And they were talking about a school in San Diego, a fairly wealthy school in San Diego, and they were losing lots of library books. And so they gave out of cash reward for library books to be returned without question. And they had almost no response. And they went to the student body council and they said, what's the problem? Why isn't there a response? And the student body council said, nobody here needs $5 or $2 or $1. But if you give us something that we want, you're going to see a much better response. And they said, what do you want? And they said, for each book is returned, we'd like to see one day when we don't have to dress in the school-issued PE clothes. And of course, the administration changed the reward system and they got lots and lots of library books back. So we start to look at what goes on inside that black box and inside of what goes on inside that mind. And we start to make a more informed, a better response to our children. We want to know what needs they're seeking out. We want to understand, because the most ridiculous, seemingly irrational behaviors in our children or in others somehow serve some purpose. And we want to understand that. The term control for behaviorists does not mean coercion. It means predictability and adherence to scientific laws. I think maybe one of the most dangerous aspects of when somebody abandons behaviorism altogether is they end up reinforcing things that they're not aware of. If you don't pay attention, if you don't learn about behavioral reinforcement, if you don't understand its place as a parent, then you'll find yourself reinforcing things that you're not aware of. The most simple example that all of us can relate to is when we give into a tantrum, right? If we give into a tantrum and we give into it intermittently, meaning sometimes we give into it right away, sometimes we wait a long time, but we give into it, we are reinforcing it with the most powerful reinforcement schedule that we know of in behavioral theory, which is intermittent reinforcement schedule. And the extinction of that behavior is going to be very, very difficult. So, for example, if we don't pay attention to it, if we don't think about it, and if as therapists or treatment programs we're not paying attention to it and using it well, then we're often going to be unintentionally reinforcing things that we don't know that we're reinforcing, and that's of course very undesirable. Modern behavioral's goal is to make us feel as if we have embraced healthy behaviors and better choices as our own. Maybe one of my biggest challenges to people who dismiss behavioral theory altogether is the assumption that children are little adults. Children are not little adults. I've heard for years now that argument against giving participation trophies to children. And the fact of the matter is, we want, at an early age, children to take the risk to participate. It's very appropriate to give participation trophies to young children. As they grow and mature and through adolescence, it's okay to reward successes in spelling bees and athletic sports and so forth. That's okay. But for young children, the first few years of a sport, we want to reinforce them taking the social, emotional risk to participate, to try something. It's very, very important. And as adults, we might even need that reward sometimes, just being praised for trying. So, but the bottom line is children are not little adults. And the theory doesn't tell us that something that is reinforced externally is not, it doesn't prevent it from becoming internalized. In fact, I think most parents would rather talk a child into something, convince a child of something, reason, debate with the child, argue with the child, nag with the child. They want to get them to change from the inside out. And that's not how children change. Children don't have the prefrontal cortex. They're not thinking like adults. And so reinforcement theory oftentimes becomes the foundation, the starting point, the jumping off point for greater insight later on. Similar to the idea of faking it till you make it. You don't ask the track athlete who's running around the track, do you believe in cardiovascular fitness? He's doing it. She's doing it. You merely reward it, reinforce it, acknowledge it. Early behaviorism focused simply on creating behavior change in the moment and by any means necessary. Modern behavioral theory highlights concepts around generalizability and transferability, as well as creating a dynamic of intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. So we're very careful to pay attention to, for example, praising and acknowledging effort. Effort is something that people can't control. Sometimes they can't control an outcome. Sometimes when we praise outcome in children instead of effort in children, they choose simpler tasks, easier tasks, or cheat on a task. So for example, rewarding, reinforcing, acknowledging somebody's effort, somebody's willingness to take the risk is a fantastic way to create some deep, powerful, and important intrinsic change. Functional analysis. It's similar to what I was talking about with identifying the benefits of destructive behaviors. I used to ask my clients all the time, what's the benefit of being depressed? The more resistant and uninsightful they were, the more they would dismiss that assignment in question. The more they were willing to work, the more insightful they were, and this is we helped them to get there. The more they were able to say things like, "Well, I guess when you're depressed, people go easy on you. When you're depressed, people feel sorry for you and give you attention. When you're depressed, people do things for you that you don't have to do yourself." So they can begin to talk about those types of things. Identify the function of behavior. What consequences maintain the behavior? What is it serving? What does the individual get by doing the behavior? Sometimes called a secondary gain. A primary gain is anxiety reduction, emotional distress reduction. A secondary gain, I might bite my nails to get rid of some nervous energy. But if I get my father's attention from biting my nails, even if it's negative, but I get him to pay attention to me, that's a secondary gain. What does the individual avoid by doing the behavior? Right? Can I avoid something that I don't want? That's pretty self-explanatory. And we begin to identify functional alternatives. What is their adaptive skill set? That's why we do the war story assignment. We want you to say, what were you getting out of it? What can you do to get that same need met? I just finished visiting a wonderful program in Portland, Maine that talked about this idea about creating an environment where passions can be explored, where connection can be found in all the various activities that they lay over these young men, give to these young men. It's a fantastic example of using the core needs that they have, that the addiction is fulfilling, and finding other ways, more healthy, appropriate ways to get those needs met. What will increase the likelihood of teaching these alternative skills? Strength and limitation. So you're identifying the resources that the person has. This can be thought of in terms of some learning differences also, and how can you take advantage of the strengths. If you try to teach somebody who has a reading disorder and you're doing it through the written word, of course it's ridiculous. If you're trying to teach somebody with a slow processing speed and you don't give them other ways to retain the information, you're not taking advantage of the resources. So functional analysis looks at all the resources and the way that somebody can learn and how they can adapt. There's some concepts in behavioral theory that we can't live without. This first one I think is so important for parents, and it's the idea of extinction burst. Because extinction burst, if you don't know about it, if you're not planning on it, for some of us it's intuitive. But in our program, even if parents aren't ready and prepared for this, they often can lose heart. Extinction burst is the temporary increase of a behavior once reinforcement is removed, right? If you stop reinforcing a tantrum by giving a child what it wants, what are you likely to see? You're likely to see an increase in that behavior. So that's a very important thing to be aware of, to prepare yourself for. Because if you don't prepare yourself for that, you could easily lose hope, lose heart in the process. Successful approximations. Shaping is the reinforcement of behaviors as they come to approximate the desired behavior. So you reward small steps toward that overall objective, overall goal. And that's okay. Yes, he's not completely working on all of his issues, but we acknowledge that this week that he wrote a paper. Yes, he's still really struggling with delay of gratification, but we're going to pay attention to the fact and reward him, praise him for the fact that he spent 10 more minutes on his bow drill fire activity than he did the day before, than he has since he's been here. Yes, she still is overwhelmed with anxiety, but she stood up in group and shared her letter of accountability with the group today. So we're gonna talk about that, pay attention to that, verbally reinforce that through praise and attention and acknowledgement. The risks and vulnerabilities of the theory of behavioral reinforcement theory. I think this is a great list. Without a strong behavioral background and subsequent staff training, treatment becomes less systemic. The responses by staff, teachers, clinicians, etc. tend to become more reactive, arbitrary, and punitive, not less. This is something I feel so passionate about, this idea about it being punitive, about it being arbitrary. If it's not systemically understood and implemented, then my mood, how I'm feeling, what I arbitrarily value versus what we value as a system, our shared value as a parental system, as a culture in our program, doesn't get reinforced necessarily. It's how I'm feeling that day. So discussing it, unraveling it, figuring out what you want to reinforce it is an important part of it for us and for parents. The thing that probably drives me up the wall the most about what I hear in the culture out there in our program and in follow-up programs is this complete dismissal of behavioral theory that leaves people susceptible to this and doesn't understand, isn't informed by, number one, the research, right? But number two, it sells to a parent who struggles to set a boundary. That might be the most commonly shared characteristic or attribute of the parents that come to our program, is our challenge, our difficulty, our discomfort with setting boundaries. So if you sell me a model where I don't have to do that, where the child's going to change, and I don't have to set that uncomfortable boundary for me and risk the fact that he'll be upset or think that I'm a bad father or she'll emotionally abandon me, if you can sell me that model, I'm off the hook. I'm glad to buy that. I hope that that's true. There's no such thing as a non-behavioral approach. It's just a question of whether you're doing it the right way. We cannot not reinforce things by our attention, by something as simple as our eye contact or our willingness to listen to somebody. We reinforce. Not understanding it, not naming it, not being conscious of it is, as a treatment program, completely irresponsible. I was listening to a presentation one time where somebody was presenting on a non-behavioral approach in therapy, and then they talked about handing out tokens, symbolic tokens that demonstrated some principle that the individual had arrived at. And I raised my hand to point out and said, just because you don't call that behavioral reinforcement doesn't mean it's not. Right? We don't want to overwhelm or flood the person. That's not intelligent use of behavioral reinforcement theory. We don't want to give $1,000 to a small child for doing one small thing. Praise can be something. Acknowledging effort, like I said, can be something. Is an important thing that the research tells us improves a child's willingness to try difficult things, to take healthy risks. to explore. So using it intelligently, understand. And that's what my book talks about. It asks you in that chapter and in the other chapters to look at yourself to the extent that you're aware of what you're reinforcing and what you're not, and how you are accidentally, inadvertently, at times reinforcing things you don't want to see continue. What you do instead is to reduce the awareness of what and how your reinforcement. The lack of attention, the lack of awareness, the lack of conscious use means just that. You are inadvertently and unconsciously reinforcing something. This sells well to parents who feel guilty. Getting kids to change, like I said, from the inside out protects parents' fragile sense of self. This is what I talk about in one of the chapters in the book on control versus influence, and on one of my webinars on control versus influence. I found that people that are reluctant or put off by behavioral theory tend to use more emotionally coercive responses. Guilting, shaming, and it's subtle. These aren't things that people come out and say shame on you, although sometimes they do. It could be by a look, by an expression, by a tone of voice, by a gesture. So learning the difference between emotional coercion, learning the difference between trying to get a child to believe what you believe versus saying this is the boundary, this is the limit, this is what I'm comfortable with, I'm setting it, and you don't have to like it, agree with it, but I'm going to enforce it in this house, in this program. Like I said, this is a repeat. That's a repeat thing. We become less disappointed to view clients' issues through a sophisticated lens, missing those dynamics that are well explained by behavioral theory. Understanding behavioral concepts, understanding how the mind works, understanding the things that I'm discussed today from functional analysis, all of that adds to the sophistication, to the complexity of the human being. And even understanding how things like flight to health and therapy, getting good real quick, in other words, are something that we could accidentally, inadvertently reinforce. When I was visiting this program with these young men who were recovering addicts, we were talking about this in a context. We had a couple of meetings, and in one of the meetings, one of the young men shared that honestly he was having some ambivalence about maintaining his sobriety after he finished his programs. And one of the other parents was triggered by that, and she spoke up to clarify. And the father of the young man that was sharing said, I just want to acknowledge something. That was something he wasn't able to say some time ago. He told me what I wanted to hear. And then he got to the point where he was willing to take the risk to tell me the truth. Essentially, turning back over to me my responsibility for my anxiety and not taking it on for himself. And it was a powerful lesson to the family. And what he reinforced in front of 80 people was his son's willingness to take a risk. And I thought that was a very deep and meaningful moment in the sessions we had. I've heard children use words with us and with you, words like punish, to hold the parents hostage. This is not a punishment. It's not merely a punishment. It's not only a punishment, but it's okay, especially when things are very risky. It's okay to give an adverse consequence response to behavior that we want to see diminish, especially when it's dangerous. There's a story. It's a generic story. But if you had a neighbor who came to you, sharing to you, venting to you, and said, my 18-year-old daughter, she's a freshman in college, she's gone over her cell phone bill significantly the last 3 months. And the first month I talked to her about it. We made a plan. The second month she did it again. And it just came today again, and she gave me, I got the third bill in a row, 3 months in a row, where she went over significantly her allowance of data and minutes, and it's costing me a lot of money. It's too much. And what would you say to that father or mother? And I don't think any of us would not include the idea you could make her pay for it. You could shut it off. There are some cell phone companies that actually you can turn off the data when you want at a certain time, right? All of those are adverse responses to behavior that you want to see diminished. We get it at work when we get a speeding ticket. If your child is running out in traffic, you're going to yell, you're going to grab them. You're going to give them an adverse consequence because they're exhibiting in that moment very, very dangerous behavior. There's a weakness with punishment, but it's not that it's punitive. And if we don't understand how we use punishment, we're going to be more punitive. It's going to be emotional and reactive. If we understand the science behind it and we give ourselves permission, then we're going to use it consciously. We're going to walk in the front door with it. And we're going to say, it's okay. If you spill something on the floor because you're being careless, you're going to clean it up, or you're going to pay for it, or you're going to work it off. That's okay. And when you come to evoke, that isn't only punishment, but it's okay to say, yeah, you've lost some freedoms. Yes, you were stealing. Yes, you were cutting on yourself. Yes, you were skipping school. It's not just that. It's a part of that. It's just the idea that we parents can get held hostage by that idea. And like I said, treating children like little adults is one of the mistakes we make when we think about behavioral reinforcement theory. It's a model that uses both behavioral and relational approaches, respects the child's development, prevents abuses by the authority figures, and increases insight commensurate with what we know about how children learn. Behavioral models improve generalization and internalization, and a follow the leader or guru approach posits the authority as the expert and diminishes the child's ability to develop their own sense of self through trial and error and exploration. Folks, I can't say this any clearer than this. Real therapy looks at helping somebody develop a more whole, a more complete sense of themselves, who they are, what they know, how they feel, what they think, what they want. Problem solving can be a part of that, but it is a minor part of that. And oftentimes we think of it as problem solving. And the follow me or the charismatic leader approach doesn't do well to foster or encourage those things. It's important. That's why I talk about all the time, valuing the struggle. There's so much that we talk about with logical and natural consequences with children that do so much of the teaching. I remember I used to tell this story years ago. I was hiking with the group one day, back when I used to hike with the groups and do therapy. I eventually stopped hiking with them because therapy was hard to do, formal therapy, while I was hiking. So during my therapy days, I would sit down. But back in the days when I was hiking, I remember hiking with the group one day, and we were following a fairly narrow trail in the forest. And I was at the back of the group, and because I was talking to the student that I was in session with, and I noticed that we walked by a bunch of trash. And one of our ethics, one of our values in wilderness therapy is to always pick up trash wherever we go, not just ours, but everybody's. So I'm in the back of the group. Everybody's actually had to step over or walk right by this trash. So I whistled and I called the entire group back. We circled up around the trash, and I just said, "Would somebody pick that up, please, and put it in our garbage bag?" And somebody did. And then I said, "Okay, let's hike." I didn't give a speech about the environment or trash or global responsibility. I just pulled them back, made them walk back, paused, looked at it. It was a simple behavioral moment, and the internalization becomes a part of that. So many of us look back on our childhood. You see this in movies. I make often reference to this principle in the movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where you resent those things your parents made you do when you were a kid, even family vacations that they made you go on, and then those become some of your greatest memories. So if we listen to the child at face value, and I'm talking children from birth to 25, if we listen to them at face value and we only hear the face value message, we're not acting like an adult in a relationship. And it's okay for them not to get it immediately, for them not to understand it, for them to just deal with the struggle, with the try and fail model, and figure themselves out. And then provide a safe place like you have at Evoke, or afterwards, provide a safe place, a safe context for them to learn those lessons. But to value the struggle is important. Behavior elements in a program provide safe context for children. Is there value to the shift at all? I think there is, of course. It helps those of us who are more autocratic. I talk about this with my son, with my firstborn, and I would suppose that this is not an uncommon mistake for people to make with their firstborn child. At least it wasn't uncommon for me, and I've seen it with others. You know the old saying that your firstborn child, everything's perfect, and by your thirdborn, fourthborn child, if you go that far, you're just happy if they're staying alive because you're just preoccupied with things. You can't get it perfect all the time. Um, if we're autocratic and rigid in our parenting, if it's a kind of a totalitarian system, this absolutely moves us away from that, pauses our process, asks us to think, asks us to be intentional, helps us to avoid the power struggle. So I think for those parents, taking a big step back is important. And the pendulum is so far that way, that's absolutely going to be our emphasis. Also, this helps us, like I talk about in the book, the entire chapter on behavioral change, it helps us focus on the underneath, the wound, rather than the symptom. Otherwise, we'll create a dynamic that they talk about in psychodynamic theories of sublimation, right? Somebody will just substitute some other behavior to address that, and it still might become a problem at some point. And then learning to be intentional rather than one size fits all. Some children, you all know this, some children are going to do better in your family with simple behavioral reinforcement theory. Some children are going to be so good at the talk that you'll want to do that. Some you're going to do very well to pull out. There are times in the programs where with a specific child, I will use a different approach early on in the program or late in the program, or even in a given day, depending upon how their mood is. If they're upregulated, anxious, angry, I might use a different approach than if they're low, if their regulation is low, if they're down, if they're unanxious, if they're present. So again, the summation, the basic thesis is you don't get to choose whether you're using behavioral reinforcement in your program or in your parenting. What you get to choose is if you're going to do it well, if you're going to do it thoughtfully, if you're going to do it with an awareness of the larger context of what modern behavioral theories offer us. And so the invitation is to explore that self, to figure yourself out, to figure out your truth, your messages, your values, to figure out your anger, your sadness, your frustration, to separate out that control versus influence that we talk about in that webinar, to separate out the emotional coercion, and to not get sucked into, to not buy into a model because it's easy, because it removes some of the important challenges that we need to go through, that we need to face as parents in terms of the boundaries that we need to set to be successful, to be healthy. All right, Michael, I'm happy to take any questions on any topic before I go to the upcoming event slides. All right, no questions have come in yet. It's coming up, folks. I'm getting very excited. Just 2 weeks and 2 days from now. Is that right? 2.5 weeks from now. The opening night gala, October 26th. Hope to see some of you there. The play Wilderness will be opening up in New York for a few weeks, and then it will move on across the country next year. So if you can't make it, hopefully we'll come to a city near you next year. You can follow us on onguardarts.org for all that information of that play that we helped contribute to. The upcoming workshops, I guess the September one, I haven't updated this slide. So October 15th and 16th is this weekend. That's the next one. We try to do one every month as often as we can. Contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more info and to RSVP. We want all families that can possibly go to these to go to these. These are multifamily, experiential, inspirational, psychoeducational. You can also, if it's a good time, combine that, ask your therapist to combine that with a visit to the field to visit your child. I think one of the most recent ones, I think they had 25 parents, and I think 21 of them or something like that went out to the field to visit their children. Heroic Journeys, probably too late for any of you. We're having a Heroic Journeys workshop starting on this Friday. We have this is for multi-families. Finding You in Park City, a couple of spots left with that. In fact, the date is the 10th to the 13th. I just changed the date today, so I apologize. Got to update this slide. Michael, help me remember that for Thursday night. You can contact intensives at evoketherapy.com or call us there. Stephanie can help you with that. We want all parents to go to 6 12-step groups while their child is with us. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Nar-Anon, or Alateen. So you can go to the website, find meetings in your area. Please, if you haven't done it yet, go try 6 of them. Parent support groups coming up. New York on the 19th this month. Los Angeles at the beginning of the month. Notice that there's a new room in New York. It's room C204. And in LA, we're going to do that potluck Sunday afternoon, no traffic thing that we do. And remember that daylight savings ends that night. So be sure to set your clocks back then. Bay Area and Atlanta coming up. Toronto on December 12th. Stephanie at evoketherapy.com to RSVP or for more information. Follow us on social media, and for those of you who are listening to this, you already know this. For those of you who are watching this live or recorded, you will know that now all of these webinar broadcasts are also being recorded for podcasts. So you can, on your iTunes, you can go to the iPod app, podcast app, and you can download evoketherapy.com's Evoke Therapy Programs podcast there. You can subscribe there. If you have an Android device or an iPod, iOS, you can go to SoundCloud. You can download the SoundCloud app, and you can download them there. So you can listen to these anywhere all the time. We're going to be recording all of these from now on. You can find the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook. You can go to our blog. Our pursuits trips, those are some of the scheduled ones. Those are for young adults and families. The book is on paperback, also audio. Go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page to buy books, and a portion of those recommended books by our therapists, a portion of the proceeds go to charity to help people who can't afford therapy. All right, any last questions before I close up this evening? No questions. Hopefully that means I got it so clear that you didn't have any questions. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you for participating. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I hope these are helpful points of contact. Let's say, I didn't change the date. Boy, today's date, I edited my own slides tonight, so that's why you're seeing all these mistakes. The next webinar will be this Thursday night. So that'll be the 13th, I think. This Thursday night at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, I'll be talking about addiction and connection, the relationship to connection. Have a fantastic evening. I'll talk to you later in the week. Good night.